Welcome to the Dealing with Goliath podcast. The mission of Dealing with Goliath is to sharpen the psychological edge in negotiation, ethical influencing, and high-impact conversation for business leaders who want to be more effective under pressure, uncover hidden value, and build greater connection, all while increasing profitability. Now, today we are doing the longer form podcast interview because it's a fascinating topic that I think huge amount of both executives as well as business owners need to open their eyes to. And it is one of these things, one of these conversations that when we have it, I believe it will be one of those things you might look back on, because this is seeing how things are going to develop in the coming years. Let's introduce the guest. So my guest today is Dr. Dale Whelehan, social entrepreneur, behaviour scientist and chief executive officer. He graduated from Trinity College, Dublin, with a diverse range of experience comprising human capital, organisational behaviour, management, change, culture, workforce experience, performance consulting, representation and rights, and quality assurance. There's a lot of different strands coming together there. It's very impressive. He leads out the team at 4 Day Week Global. This is a not-for-profit organization who are creating 1 million new years of free time. They provide a platform for like-minded people who are interested in supporting the idea of the 4-day week as part of the future of work. The company to date has been involved in supporting international pilot studies, exploring the feasibility of reduced work hours across different sectors and jurisdictions. And most recently, their team was named in Time 100 Most Influential Companies of 2023 and have been identified by Forbes as one of the most promising changes of 2023. They've discussed the benefits of the 4-day week through all sorts of leading publications, including The Atlantic, The Insider, The New York Times, Bloomberg, Fast Company, BBC, Sky News, and The Wall Street Journal. Dr. Dale Whelehan, it is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Al.
Well, look, let's just set this up with a few quick statistics, right? Because you've been doing a lot of trials with an awful lot of different companies, both in the UK and Ireland, I know it's in Australia and all sorts of different jurisdictions. And just to read you a few of the stats for the audience, just to frame why this is inherently interesting, 36% increase in revenue, 42% decrease in employee resignations, is a big one for staff turnover, 68% reported reduction in burnout. And I know that's a particular area of your expertise that you're writing a book on, we'll dip into later. 54% increase in workability, and 63% found it easier to attract talent. This is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show, Dale, as we talked about before, which was that this could indeed be a nice edge, if you will, a differentiating factor for smaller businesses to attract talent. So with all that said, talk us through it. So where did this come from? It sounds like a beautiful utopian vision that I'm sure most staff are going, oh my God, get me into a company of 4-day week. Can you clarify, first of all, what it is and what it's not, maybe, to start with, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alan. Thanks for such a lovely introduction as well. So the 4-day week is modeled off a principle called 100-80-100, which is the trademarked principle of 4-day week global, which says 100% pay for 80% time for 100% output. So assuming you come from a work company that currently contracts you to work 40 hours, that would mean receiving the same amount of pay, but actually only doing 32 hours of work. And so the genesis of this idea came from a pilot on a company called Perpetual Guardian, which is what the founders of 4-day week global are part of, Andrew Barnes and Charlotte Lockhart. So Perpetual Guardian, based out of Auckland in New Zealand, and they basically said that there is an opportunity to look at improving the productivity of our workforce. Some of the very preliminary and basic science says that human productivity, particularly in the cognitive space, is limited between 2.5 to 3 hours a day. And actually rest is really important in order to try and improve that cognitive function. So Andrew trialed it on Perpetual Guardian, brought in external academic expertise to evaluate the pilot. And from that, a hugely successful trial, 4-day week global was founded. Back in 2019, then the main activities of the organization was to essentially showcase the findings of the perpetual guardian trial and try and make the business case for it in different organizations. And one of the key activities thereafter was the conduct of pilot studies, as you mentioned, in different jurisdictions, understanding what does reduced working hours look like, not just in, you know, a white collar sector job like professional services, but also in, you know, a manufacturing sector, in healthcare, in whatever sector it is. So we've been trying to understand different business models and understand what reduced working hours, how reduced working hours could be facilitated in those different contexts. We have published our initial trial findings from the US, Ireland, the UK, and Australasia to date. And our aim is to be a truly global organization. And so we have pilots running in every continent at the moment, with the view then to creating 1 million new years of free time, as you mentioned, in the next 5 years. And how we actually facilitate that then is recognizing that with each individual that's actually working on a reduced working hour schedule, they will create at least, you know, 8 hours of free time a week. And when that grows to a team and then to an organization and to a society, 1 million years is not that hard to achieve when you look at what the exponential growth of this conversation of 4-day week has seen over the last 12 months.
It's fascinating stuff, and I can imagine a lot of people are listening to it and thinking, "Oh, that sounds great," but and that's always where they have all of these quite practical obstacles, barriers, and indeed fears. Both maybe they're the business owner and they're thinking, "Oh, I'd love to do that, not just for me but for my staff as well." Other people who are maybe, you know, as I said, are working for other people and they would love to work for a company that does this or that takes this on. What are some of the things to get right? Now, one of the things just to point out to everybody is that it's not that you're cramming 40 or 50 hours of work into 4 days. It's not that you're doing 12-hour days, essentially, is it? It's that it's the same amount of hours. It's the same amount of work output for 20% less time in. Now, a lot of people are moving already to, look, just pay me for the result. Why does it matter how much time it makes? So for some people in some industries, this already is like, this makes perfect sense, right? So could you just talk to a few of those particular points? Like, what are some of those key obstacles, both practical and indeed psychological?
Yeah, and you've really hit the nail on the head there, Al. This is about moving from time as this arbitrary metric of productivity to actually outcome-based work. And I think a lot of sectors are transitioning to that. And if certain sectors aren't, they're recognizing that they need to start moving more into that sort of space. Now, certain sectors can't do that. In sectors where continuity of, you know, patient care is required in a hospital setting, for example. So we need to be a little bit more innovative around looking at productivity in those settings as well. But when we look at, say, we'll take our traditional, when people think of a 4-day week, it's Friday off, albeit it's not always a Friday off. So organizations will typically, when they embark on one of our trials, they go through an 8-week onboarding process, essentially of change intervention. So they start from the very basic question of, why are you doing the 4-day week? So actually establishing that change narrative in the first place and being quite clear about it. Organizations come from many reasons. Some come from a recruitment and retention, a talent point of view. Some come from wanting to reduce the burnout of their workforce. Even smarter ones are doing it because they know if they reduce the burnout, they can improve the productivity of their workforce. And others are coming from it, recognizing that businesses play a big role in creating a more equal and sustainable world. And we know a 4-day week helps to achieve some of those outcomes as well. So being quite clear on that change narrative is critical to establishing a communication that's going to appease and reassure the hesitancies of all your stakeholder groups, whether they be a board, whether they be your internal staff, whether they be your customers. Then you actually decide, well, what type of 4-day week am I going to do? And this is where the 100-80-100 principle allows flexibility, because all it essentially is saying is that it's 20% reduced time and 100% output, but that doesn't mean that business needs to close 1 day a week. So if that's not possible for your organization, you may wish to have some of your staff working Monday to Thursday, some working Tuesday to Friday, albeit they're working on a lower, like a more skeletal staffing structure on 2 of those days in the week. But you might find that actually makes sure that everyone gets well rested and performance is still maintained, if not improved. Others may look at well, we actually can't give full-time off. We can't give a 4-day week this week or the next week, and we need people in full-time. But actually across a month period, we will provide time in lieu so that 180-100 is being, achieved through a longer period of time. And then we look at those more complex sectors like healthcare, like service provision industries. And what they are doing is some are actually deciding. There was a famous kind of fish and chip shop example in one of the pilots to actually close business when business is not performing. So actually, if it's costing you more time to keep the business open, then actually close the business down and keep it at full time during the peaks of your work, i.e., focusing on output as opposed to focusing on time. And a really famous example then in healthcare, in the Icelandic public sector, was they realized, okay, we actually are going to have to hire more staff in order to offset this reduced working hour schedule. But when we looked at the macroeconomic costs of that, we're able to reduce our reliance on agency staff. We're able to reduce our staff sick leave and absenteeism rates. And so actually there's a net benefit because we've created a more sustainably minimum viable staffing structure that's actually able to just provide service without burning out throughout the process of providing that service. So all of those different models allow us to see how something like this is possible in many different business case approaches. So deciding that 4-day week and figuring out, which one's going to suit your business's needs is what organizations will next do. Then they will actually say, well, we're actually moving away from time now as this arbitrary metric of productivity and moving towards outcomes. But that means actually organizations need to define what productivity looks like in the organization in the first place. And many haven't done that. So they will start to establish, OKRs and metrics of assessment of performance. And once they've established them, they can work backwards and say, okay, well, if we need to achieve these outcomes on a Thursday now instead of a Friday, what are the key barriers in the work week that is going to not allow that to be to occur? So that's long meeting times, that's ineffective processes, technology not being leveraged for productivity instead of hacking people's productivity, and lastly, underpinning all of that is culture and leadership as an enabler, as opposed to a barrier for effective high performance. So once you kind of get that roadmap essentially of, okay, well, I know what the productivity looks like now, I know what the type of 4-day week we're going to do, how do I make sure that if we actually embark on this, that I can safeguard against failure? And that's where you need to have things like amber and red flags within your organization's trial to make sure that the business is not going to be completely derailed by this, or at least that your business is sensitive enough to pick up when things are going wrong and how to remedy them as quickly as possible. And so when undergoing all of these sort of changes, it's something that organizations have never really done for the first time or before. So you're facilitating the development of a growth mindset within leaders as well. And what we have found is that why this works relative to some other change management interventions around, Lean Six Sigma and productivity interventions is that you are fundamentally building psychological contract with the worker because you're gifting them something in return for something else. And where lean and, agile ways of working currently fail is that they demand of the individual more and more and more, but don't give them anything in return. In fact, they gift them more work oftentimes.
You're even punished for being efficient.
You're punished for being productive. Yeah. And anyone who looks at any of the science around high performance in any industry that, like elite sport or aviation or all those sort of things, they all preach about the importance of rest and recovery from periods of high performance. So that's the fundamental cultural and mindset shift that leaders will go through while embarking on this journey as well.
Yeah, and you're kind of hitting the nail on the head. I suppose it's all part and parcel. Because one of the questions I asked, when we were talking before, was all around, I presume this needs a pretty advanced culture through a business to make this work on all sorts of levels. But the mere fact that someone in a leadership position would want to or is interested in instigating this in the first place probably is the type of organization that has this stuff largely in place anyway. But there is that sort of slightly more cynical voice in my head, which I can imagine some leaders jump to, where they say, well, hold on a second. If you're able to get 30% increase in productivity by working 20% less, like, why are we inefficient for that extra day? Why can we not be more efficient and work the extra day and be even more, as you say, in that mindset of greater productivity? Are there some of those cynical, as I say, you have to be able to sell it to it's great to bring in the human side, but as I say to a lot of negotiation clients, you often have to sell it to the psychopath in the room as well, just on as you said, the cold hard economics. And that's the beauty of this. It does work on the cold hard stats and economics, but is it the rest and recuperation that allows people to compress the work into that time? Whereas if you add that extra day, it's, as you said, people are only able to really focus and get proper output work about approximately 3 hours a day anyway.
Yeah. So there's a few things I think that are at play as to why it works and why returning to a 5-day week and expecting the same results is probably not going to work. First of all, an outdated management philosophy that needs to be put to bed is that humans are not machines, and that expecting someone to perform at a consistent pace and rate of work based off an outdated 9-to-5 working model that was based in the Industrial Revolution is just, all evidence is pointing that it is creating a burned out workforce. And we know, even from a very crude economic perspective, we know burnout is costing organizations huge amounts of money from absenteeism and productivity and presenteeism and all of that sort of stuff. So even if anything, from a selfish point of view, if you want to improve productivity of your workforce, reduce the burnout of your workforce. And if we know that longer working hours is increasing burnout, then reduce working hours and you will reduce burnout. So that's one thing at play. The second thing is that, contrary to humans as machines, humans are fueled by motivation. And if you want to get the best out of your worker, you need to figure out how to motivate your worker. And this is where organizations really struggle to motivate their workforce. In fact, Gallup would say that only about 10% of the workforce in Ireland and the UK are engaged. So look at 90% have potential to be more engaged and to produce more as a result of engagement in work. And we know that when you put trust in workers, when you give them a sense of autonomy over their work, when you make them feel competent in the work that they do, then that fuels their levels of intrinsic motivation. But like any high performance industry, you need to be able to ramp up for success and equally ramp down after a really successful period. You wouldn't expect someone to go out and run a marathon and then run the marathon again. You would expect them to rest and recuperate and go back and do better the next time from that recovery process. So that is what we're...
Sorry, continue, sorry.
So what I'm trying to do essentially advocate is that we need to move away from these outdated Taylorism principles around management to actually a science of human performance and integrating that into new management styles within workplaces and realizing that you will gain so much more by leveraging the physiology and psychology of your worker to become optimal instead of an assumption that they are going to perform consistently at a consistent rate, irrespective of what levers you pull in work as a leader.
Absolutely. And I love the sporting analogy. I think that a lot of the points hit home there when you use that, where you say, well, if someone who plays a football match, a professional athlete, or a rugby match or whatever, you don't expect them to do it again the next day. You expect recuperation, you expect the tactical side, and then different types of work and levels of focus to then be on for game day. And people kind of intuitively get that. But as you said, and dare I use the word corporate, at least in a business setting, they don't so much.
Mm-hmm.
And it is an important point. I think that yeah, there were quite a number of points you made there to pick up on, but one of the big ones, and I know it's an area of particular interest and expertise for you, is all around burnout. So let's just explore that, because I know for quite a few industries that almost wear burnout as a badge of honor, where that kind of, oh, we've done the hard yards type of sporting analogy time. We've put that time and energy in. Like, it used to be a big thing in a lot of the medical circles that young doctors would have to do these horrendous hours. It's big in a huge amount of different areas, particularly, areas of particularly aggressive finance, areas of software development. And I know, because I have clients in software where there are a lot of culture there where you're going to leave us sooner or later anyway, because it's high turnover and there's people moving jobs because they have tons of opportunity. So they go, well, why not burn you out? Because you're going to be gone anyway. So who cares? And which just sounds cynical, but it also makes certain sense from one point of view with the idea that they're going to leave anyway. So it is a profound change, isn't it? That getting the head around to how do we optimize for human performance. So let's talk about burnout, because you were saying this when we were talking about fatigue. Not all fatigue is the same. Ideas of lack of sleep versus other forms of fatigue. Can we dive into that for a few minutes? So I know you have an upcoming book on the topic. So what are some of the key points you think business owners should know about that you want to get out into the public consciousness?
Yeah, so this is a hugely complex area of research, so much so that I've been studying it for years and oftentimes have to double check myself to make sure I understand it. I think the problem is that we actually use terms like fatigue, exhaustion, tiredness, burned out interchangeably. But actually, in many instances, they're caused by different things. It's really interesting. Many of the terms that we use to describe our emotional experiences of fatigue are actually machine-like metaphors. So we use burned out, we use grind to a halt,
worn out. Yeah.
Worn out. We have internalized a metaphor of our bodies and our brains as machine-like, and I think that is, and I think in reality, obviously, we aren't like that. So there's often that sort of mismatch between what I want to do versus what I'm capable of actually doing. And I think true high performance looks at understanding that you have a physiology and a psychology that needs to be minded and taken care of. And once you understand how best to leverage it, that's when you build high performance culture. So I'll touch on burnout first. So burnout outright is an organizational issue. So it is not an individual's problem. When we look at all the research around burnout, it says it's caused by three things. It's caused by an individual experiencing exhaustion, an individual experiencing a sense of inefficacy or non-competency within their work, and experiencing cynicism towards their work. And in many instances, all of those three factors are caused by poor culture within workplaces. Exhaustion through overworking and ineffective working, inefficiency coming from, or inefficacy coming from people feeling like they're not doing a good job and being scolded by management as not being good enough, and cynicism then emerging when people just become disengaged from their work and therefore don't feel any sort of sense of accomplishment in what they do, and so therefore want to completely detach away from that. So when you look at all those industries like surgery, like law, finance, their minimum viable structure is, getting young graduates who are highly motivated out of third level education, putting them through their paces, not addressing some of these issues that we know are causing burnout. People then leaving that sector, maybe going to a smaller boutique firm, and the culture just perpetuates itself then in different, and that's how professions essentially get these reputations for themselves. And healthcare is also, has long-standing issues around burnout. An alternative, and wouldn't it be brilliant if we looked at what would a positive experience for a young worker entering into one of these professions look like? So you are highly rewarded, you're really looked after, you don't feel exhausted in your 20s, and therefore you actually might stay with the firm longer term. And you might actually then, have greater institutional knowledge within the firm. Processes might improve. Because you're engaged in work, you want to reinvest in making the profession better. So that's the sort of mindset shift, I think, when you would see a burned out workforce versus an engaged workforce, which are at opposite ends of the spectrum for one another. So burnout, organizational, cultural issue. Fatigue is an emotional experience experienced by someone when they are essentially engaging in a task, and then there is a conflicting motivational demand in their environment. So I'm writing my book and my mind is telling me, go check Twitter. You haven't checked Twitter in the last half hour. And so I need to essentially evoke a higher level of effort in order to divert my attention back to the task at hand. And in doing so, my subjective level of fatigue will rise, because an increase in effort will lead to an increase in fatigue. A high performer will know when to dial up and when to dial down. So they will know, okay, I need to do this task. So I need to continue on with this task. And this level of fatigue is acceptable at the moment. And I know that once I finish this task, I need to factor in a small bit of time to recover afterwards in order to try and stop the fatigue after effect from emerging. What often happens, though, in the world of work is that people sit down at their desks 9 to 5, they take little breaks, they go from Zoom call to Zoom call, and they're constantly experiencing these motivational, conflicts, and they aren't necessarily listening to what their mind is telling them to do. And then they're going home at the end of the day and they're sitting down and they're watching TV and they're exhausted and they're getting takeaway because they're just experiencing such a high level of fatigue after effect. And that creates a spiral effect, because if you feel like that, you're not going to do things that are actually going to help with active recovery in the evening. We know that when you go out for a walk, or you engage, in a new hobby, or you connect with friends, all of those sort of things are better for recovery after a workday than sitting down and watching TV for the evening. So, but if you don't have the energy in the first place to do any of those things, it's so easy to see how you can suddenly have a really, busy work day, come home in the evening, feel exhausted, not get any active recovery. Then you don't go to bed until about 11 or 12 because you don't feel tired. And then you wake up at 6 o'clock again, you're sleep deprived. And the parameters of your performance have been lowered every day in a more, exponential rate. So that's where you start getting the blurriness between fatigue and sleep deprivation and burnout and all of these sort of things feeding into one another, but actually caused by very distinct, different, issues at different levels of organizations or within people.
Very good. And are there a few key things that, for example, a manager or leader can do to stop that? For example, having greater gaps or having more awareness of what they call manager and maker time, so that you have little admin time, so a few Zoom calls in a row and then a big break, so people can actually get some work done. Because this is often a problem where people are in meetings spread out where they can't get deep into any work in between the meetings, and then frustration unfolds. Like, what kind of few guiding principles might you give leaders or managers in that one?
And so I think this is where 4-day week actually comes into the entire conversation, because in a 4-day week, you have to be very deliberate about your time and how you structure your time in obviously a reduced working hour schedule. So when organizations redesign their work week in a 4-day week, they say, well, meetings are only taking place between this time and this time. And I am blocking out this amount of time to do deep focused work. And so that's a very fundamental but simple change organizations can do, is actually respecting people's time to get the important work done. Also, moving meetings from an hour long down to 15 minutes is amazing. How you can leverage the power of Parkinson's law expand. Time will expand and work will expand with it. Work will expand within the amount of time given to complete a task. And when you shorten the time frame, you'll be surprised that work will actually also still get done within that time frame. So essentially, by gifting people back as much time and giving them as much autonomy over their work, and then training them in some of these performance management principles, you can really create a very different worker to the one that maybe is currently operating within your organization at the moment, because you're both building their individual capability to look after their performance, but you're also providing organizational permission to better regulate their own performance. 4-day week provides the latter, and then, you know, individual training and individual kind of personal development provides the former.
Amazing. And as you said, because I was going to mention Parkinson's law, which is fabulous, because it seems to be that continually, that with greater awareness, you can actually fit the same outcome in a much shorter space of time if you have the focus. And as you said, you used a really interesting phrase there. You have the permission, i.e., this is how we've decided we're going to operate from now on. Let's move in that direction. It also sounds like when organizations dive into the 4-day week, they give that element, as you said, you know, people who are happy in their work tend to have a high level of autonomy, a high sense of purpose in what they're doing, and a sense of connection, i.e. relationship value to the colleagues and to the people in the work. And it seems to hit on all of those. Like, they feel respected because they're given the trust to, we trust you to get the same amount of work done in 4 as you would in 5 days. You know, so I can see, I mean, rather than the obvious, I don't have to work that extra, say, Friday or whatever it is, that it sounds like the obvious appeal, but it's actually more than that. It's the baseline trust and respect in the first place to give you that, right?
Yeah, and this is why, as a behavior scientist, I'm really fascinating in this 4-day week, because at its very superficial level, it seems really easy, you know, in the sense that, like, it's all you're doing is reducing working time. Well, that can be easy for some people, and that can also be an absolute nightmare for some. But actually, it's all of those behavioral changes that are happening within leaders who are learning how to better motivate their workforce, within teams who are learning how to collaborate better, thus building that relatedness component of self-determination theory, and then individuals actually learning how to better manage their performance as well. So you're creating a new paradigm in the way of working, but you're doing so under the auspice of a united goal to reduce working time. And that's why I think all interventions to date around human resource transformation have failed, is that they have failed to get collective buy-in of all stakeholders towards a common goal, and ultimately provide benefits of merit to all stakeholders involved.
And it's fascinating what you're talking about there, because you're triggering the thought that, are there certain nations or sort of national cultures, and I know there's massive generalizations in that, because in the one country, in different businesses, you'll have radically different cultures, even in the same sector.
Yeah.
But it sounded to me, and again, apologies for the generalizations, that some cultures would take to this maybe much easier and much faster than others. So again, one would assume that many staff members would jump at the chance of working in a 4-day company. But what have you found in the trials? Have there been pushback from the staff where they nearly feel like they're not being, if they're not being productive, they're not doing their job? Or, you know, there's some people like, oh, I have to do stuff. It's like, yeah, but you have this afternoon off. Like, some of my clients, for example, one of them had argued for a Friday afternoon off, yet she never took it.
Yeah,
because she felt like, if I'm not working, I'm not, you know, it's not, so somehow she's robbing from my company or something. These odd sort of money and labor beliefs way down in the background. So I'm just curious about that, because you mentioned the behavioral side. Could you talk to us about some of those insights?
Yeah, that's actually, I'm really glad you brought that up, Al, because it's a really fascinating point that's often missed from the conversation around a 4-day week, is that an organization provides permission, but ultimately it's the individual who has to take the time off. And, you know, you can lead a horse to water, you can get the team to poke and prod at the horse to take, you know, to drink the water, but ultimately it's the horse who has to drink it. And that is, I think that's where we need to probably get better at actually training people in permission to detach and to switch off. I actually think generally as a society, one of the best skills we could learn is how to detach more. It's why it's why mindfulness movement has grown so exponentially, is because we are all struggling so much in being able to just calm our anxieties and our stresses, and actually using time off as a means to do what it is supposed to do, which is to recover. So, and I suffer with this myself. I work a 32-hour work week, and Friday comes and I'm thinking about work, and I have to train myself to be like, stop doing that. Like, as in, you're not doing yourself any good by thinking about what's in your mailbox on Monday. So organizations who have to go on this journey need to realize that as well. But you can't get your staff to do that unless you provide them permission in the first place. And I think that's what the journey many organizations are realizing, is that you need to provide, the structural enablement, and then second to that, we need to get better at training people how to manage their own performance, and more importantly, manage their recovery. What people are doing in their time off, though, thankfully, by and large, is doing active recovery strategies around taking up a new hobby, engaging in volunteering, looking after elderly parents, or being able to reduce childcare costs by by looking after kids at home. So people are using that time and using it effectively, which is great. I think we haven't to date seen huge variances in cultures across nations, but I'm sure as the sample size grows, we will start to see some of those. I was really interested when we signed with our Swedish partner. The conversation, we talked about a 4-day week. It was very much, well, we were going to close business on Friday. That is what's going to happen. Like, as in, we're all unanimous in agreement that that's what this business model will look like in Sweden. You would never dare suggest closing business on a Friday in the US. So it very much had to look like, well, how can we keep our business services provided under a reduced working hour model? So I think as the conversation grows in new countries, we'll see the national rollout of a 4-day week might look quite different depending on how advanced the conversation is around working hours.
It's a fascinating one, because lead a horse to water, as you said. As somebody pointed out to me, the full thing is lead a horse. You can't lead a horse to water and make it drink, but you can salt the oats, which is the full quote. And I didn't know that. And it's that idea of the persuasive, the tease, as you say, more so the carrot than the stick in that you create the thirst. And the thirst for, I think it's the counter motivator, because a lot of people, I'd love a 4-day, but then, I need to feel I'm working. And as you said, all of those. So it's not just giving permission, but as you said, I'm fascinated to know about the level of, dare I say, education for the staff as to like rest, recovery, or as you say, active recovery. That having the bottle of wine and sitting in front of Netflix with the takeaway might feel nice in the moment, but it's not particularly optimal performance, not setting you up for the next day. So, how much emphasis is there on educating the workforce or the staff, members of staff, as to how to serve themselves best?
So I think that what we've seen in the trials to date is probably a more non-traditional education approach. Because when we think about traditional training around high performance and stuff, it might be like someone will come in and give a few webinars around how better to manage your performance. But what we've actually seen in how organizations have institutionalized a 4-day week best is by individuals showcasing actually what they're doing on their days off, and actually creating a peer support kind of network on supporting one another in knowing what to do in their time off, how better to structure their workday, how better to learn how to detach from work. And when organizations sign up to our trials, they actually come onto an online platform, which we host with over 350 companies, called Notion and Circle. And on there, they're actually learning from one another as well. So they're learning how do we do this in manufacturing in the US? And there's only a manufacturing example in Germany. So they can connect with one another. So I think that peer support process of learning has meant that we have seen results in our trials where people are reporting really higher levels of physical activity, higher levels of sleep, higher levels of hobbies being taken up, all of those sort of things, because they're learning from their peers and seeing actually, that's what I can do with my time off. It's
a big difference. And it's also the show, not just tell, because they can be told, you have permission for this. But I know from a lot of clients where they're trying to do culture change, where they're like, oh yeah, you tell us that now, but are you going to bite us in the ass about that later? Is there consequence? Then they're like, whereas when they see, oh, that's how you do it, oh, that's how all these people are doing it, they go, okay, this is a thing that I can actually get behind with less fear or
Yeah.
trepidation or anything like that. Yeah.
And that's when we look at the science of culture, there's a few things that happen. There's stability, integration, depth, elements to culture. So a culture will always try and absorb someone who's not conforming to a culture. That's typically how it happens. And when an individual enters into an organization, they will first of all experience the very superficial aspects of culture. So they'll see what's on the mission statement and on the value system and all of that sort of stuff. Then they'll start testing the waters and see whether that's actually the lived reality. And then they'll form kind of microcultures and subcultures within those systems where maybe revolution is happening to what the desired goal of management is. And that's where you start getting these pockets of resentment within organizations. I think with a 4-day week, one of the key interventions to making sure that this is an effective intervention and a safe intervention is it needs to be modeled by management. Modeling is one of the most powerful behavior change tools in organizations. And there is no point in a CEO saying, I give all my staff permission to work a 4-day week. I'm going to continue to work my 6 days because that's what success looks like. And you're always going to then create this discord between people feeling like they should be taking their time off, but also a competition to maybe stay online because that's actually what's probably being rewarded.
You can hear the parallel there between the remote working versus the people that come in and, oh yeah, you're allowed to remote work, but you're getting that feeling that people in the office are talking to the boss and displaying more of the value, and the other people are more and more distant and remote.
Yeah.
This is something we talked about before, which is the parallel of 4-day week with this idea of remote working and some of these other innovations that we're experimenting with at the moment.
And I think this is where this becomes into an issue of equality, because we know that disproportionately people who work part-time are women. We know that particularly from hybrid settings, that it benefits those groups who have traditionally been marginalized within the workplace. And what we're trying to do is move away from this performance metric of being seen and being present as being somehow committed to the organization versus actually what I deliver based off my talent and my skill. One of the questions we often get asked is, well, what do you do with part-time workers in a 4-day week? And I think you've seen many different ways of being introduced. Some will reduce pro rata, just down to 3.25. I think one of the big questions you need to ask of your part-time workers is, well, are they producing the same level of output as your 5-day workers? And if so, you actually should consider increasing their salary equivalent to those 5-day workers. Because if that's what we're talking about, if we know that it's business performance outcomes that drives, profitability, there is no justifiable reason for you not to remunerate for that level of performance, simply because someone can't be in the office or because someone can't stay in work past 5 p.m.
Gotcha. So on a negotiation front, what would you say would be the key arguments should a business leader want to step forward toward your organization, toward the 4-day week, and want to implement this, but he or she has key stakeholders who are heavily resistant, or they think it's a fad, or just whatever objections they have? What do you find are the key most persuasive arguments to step forward into the 4-day week?
Yeah, great question. I think it's important to realize that actually the genesis of us as an organization came not from, the well-being argument, but actually from a very productivity, economic output based, argument. That's where Andrew Barnes, when he was leading Perpetual Guardian, he wanted his staff to be more productive. So we have always had that, central to understanding that business leaders are key to the success of this movement. And so therefore, how do we assuage them that this is something worthwhile engaging in? I think when you look at organizational leaders, they tend to be risk averse. That's typically what happens. The more you get up in a hierarchy, the more risk averse you become, the more bureaucratic organizations become. And that is the kind of standard leadership model that we have accepted, yet we know it doesn't work for us in many instances. We also know that a changing environment now is going to require organizations to be a lot more flexible and less, rigid in how they approach societal problems. And so I think that this is one of those interventions where it gives you the opportunity to start experimenting with something like that, because you've engaged in technology transformation, you've engaged in probably finance transformation. How much have you actually engaged in human resource transformation over the last 20 or 30 years? And if you have engaged, what benefits have you seen to that? And is there potential for you to do a lot more? We know business is driven by people and people's engagement in their work. So people are our greatest asset then, and we get more by getting them more engaged in their work. So that is a very kind of like rudimentary business argument. But then look at the economic costs of it. Literally put on the back of an envelope and say, what are the overhead costs for us as an organization now at the moment, from recruitment, retention, absenteeism, sick leave, all of these sort of things? I'm pretty sure you'll find they have risen quite a lot. And what would be the cost of implementing a 4-day week? And then see what that balance sheet looks like. And I think you will find that when some of those macroeconomic costs are taken into consideration, that actually it's not going to result in a huge cost for your organization, if any at all. So that's a very nice argument to be able to frame this in a much more economic way, which can assuage some of the board and some of those stakeholders. I think for clients and customers, which drives obviously a lot of businesses, having an honest conversation with them, we have found consistently that when organizations, particularly those maybe in professional services that bill by hour or something like that, clients have actually been much happier when they have been approached and feedback sought into the process, and actually said that they actually did want to move to a more output-based model of work anyway. The billable by hour model is flawed, flawed for everyone. Flawed for the worker who feels like they need to work longer hours, flawed for the client because they probably are paying for work that's not they can't see what's being done on an hourly basis. So, a new form of partnership with the client is established, which actually seems to be more sustainable. It also helps with project creep and all those sort of issues that we know exist within organizations and negotiations and stuff like that. So they're kind of the main things that I would say business leaders should consider if trying to embark on something like this.
That's a very good case. Nicely summed up. Excellent stuff. And just as a last thought, have you found that many smaller organizations or businesses have adopted it by a point of differentiation, that as a way to attract talent that maybe larger organizations as competition for that talent can't really or haven't jumped onto that yet?
Yeah, so it's been by and large a small and medium enterprise led initiative in the pilot studies to date. And you're totally right in saying those organizations have a lot more flexibility in their benefits to be able to offer something like this, particularly because, they might not be able to offer huge healthcare packages for their staff. So they need something to help attract talent into their spaces. And they can also be a lot more agile in implementing something like this as well. Probably don't need to go through as much, sign-offs and decision-making in order to get things up and going. So certainly, but what we have seen then, and you have to realize the first trial results only came out in February. We have seen huge both public sector interest, but also large private sector interest in the last kind of 6 to 7 months. Scotland has launched a public sector 4-day week trial starting in 2024. Belgium has committed to one in next year as well. The Australian Work and Senate Care Committee has recommended one, as well as another Australian committee. The US currently has a 32-hour work act bill on the floor of the House of Representatives. Senator Bernie Sanders is bringing it up in the Senate. Like, it has kind of grown exponentially from a political point of view. We have also seen trade union bodies are now making this as part of their future trade negotiation or worker negotiations. IG Metall, which represents a large group in Germany, and the UAW, which represents Ford in the US. Coincidentally, Ford was the founder, or by many considered the founder, of the 5-day work week.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing coming from that angle. And from large private enterprise, then we are seeing, just announced yesterday, Medibank. We worked with Medibank, which is the largest private health insurance company in Australia. They've launched a 4-day week trial. We've seen Microsoft in Japan. We are seeing the Big Four currently piloting this, albeit not fully publicly at the moment. And what we will find is that in 2 to 3 years' time, and this is my view on the future of work, once this all starts to balance itself out a small bit, is that flexible, hybrid, and reduced working are going to become the norm. So actually, the future differentiators are going to look at how well those policies are implemented, and that's what the future worker is going to be looking at. Is, yes, you have these policies, but how are they actually implemented? And do you live by these policies in practice, or do you just say them to attract the right talent? And I think that's going to be a really fascinating time to watch in the future workspace.
Absolutely. Hey, you said a fascinating thing there. It was just a lovely historical reference of Ford creating the 5-day work week. Because an awful lot of people might be thinking, oh yeah, but this is a lovely idea, but it'll never happen. Well, when my father was growing up, everybody went to work and school on Saturday morning until lunchtime. That was the norm. And we forget this, that we got reduced back to 5. So what's stopping us being reduced down to 4?
Yeah. And that's a really critical point, because work has fundamentally not really changed over the last 100 years, despite our working hours, despite the fact that work has radically changed. Pre-industrial revolution time, it was normal to work 7 days a week in an agrarian society. People were producing product for their own benefit in order to feed themselves or shelter themselves. The Industrial Revolution came along, separated the worker from the means, and as a result, remuneration came into play. So people were, financially rewarded for producing a certain level of output of work. But work in the Industrial Revolution was largely repetitive and physical and, manual and all of those sort of things. And the human body, i.e. physical fatigue, that peak is reached at a much later stage than cognitive fatigue. So we can go and run a marathon if we do a bit of training, and in fact we might hit a wall and our brain will tell us we can't do it, but our legs will keep moving. Whereas we have never seen anyone been able to do 5 hours of full concentration, in full optimal mode of concentration. And that's that mismatch that we're currently happening in the world of work, is we're expecting a model of physical fatigue to be applied to what is now a largely very cognitive and emotional workforce. And that is what's exhausting the workforce so much, is because we were never built to work this many hours with the type of work that we are currently doing.
That's a fabulous point to finish on. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for such a great interview. It's fascinating. And as I said at the start, it feels like we're tapping into what will relatively quickly become the norm. Just before we finish, and actually realized that weirdly in so many interviews in the last few months, which don't seem to have anything to do with it, people inevitably bring up AI, and it didn't come up at all in our conversation. Would you say anything that will that just aid the efficiency of gaining that 100% output for 80% time? I presume it can just help that.
Yeah, so I think the AI one is going to be critical in the 4-day week conversation, because the great promise of reduced working hours came in the early 2000s with the implementation of technology. And actually what we saw instead was, an increased use of technology and no change in working hours. It's important now at this point that we leverage AI in order to help us reduce working hours, instead of it becoming something that's just going to continue to grow and grow and grow into, an unsustainable model for us as a people. Burnout rates are at the highest level that they've ever been, and it's unsustainable to keep them going at the way that it is going. So what do I think of AI? It needs to play a role in helping us to automate as much of the laborious, repetitive work. It needs to allow us to free up as much time for us to do what humans can do best, which is creativity and innovation and collaboration. And in doing so, we can create new products, new interventions, new offerings, which are going to be tailored towards the individual. And I think this is where AI is struggling at the moment, is that it is producing stuff and it's not hitting the human impact. And I know a lot of conversation talks around, how AI will take away a lot of jobs from the future of work, but it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, it presents us with an opportunity to allow humans to have more time to relax. And once we relax, we can think more broadly, and we can create better, more customer-centric products that people actually want. And AI will never be able to provide us with the level of emotional human connection that we can provide with one another. So we need to leverage that in the future of work, and allow AI to do the things that currently stops us from doing that.
Outstanding. It's exactly that. It's, take away the $10 an hour tasks, automate it, and let us add value where we add unique, personalized value, where there's a sense of connection. Yep. Absolutely. Well, look, Dr. Dale Whelehan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Al. It was a privilege.
If people want to learn more about the movement, get in touch with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, so if you want to check out our website, 4-Day Week Global, we are interested in having people of all walks of life involved in our movement. We offer a pilot program intervention if your organization wants to join a pilot. We now have a foundation program if you simply want to learn more information about a 4-day week and how it would work. We also have consulting for large organizations who, might require a bit more bespoke additional support. And lastly, we'll be aiming to create 1 million new years of free time. So we need as many people on board to help us to achieve that goal. So please do reach out if you want to become an advocate or support us in that from a philanthropic point of view as well.
Excellent. I wish you the very best of luck in getting to that 1 million.
Thanks, Al.
I think everybody. Thank you so much, Dale. Cheers.
Cheers, Al. No problem.
Bye.
Thank you.